Time now to shift focus, especially to Bharat Mandapam, where we got two of our colleagues standing by. We've got Sakal Bhat along with Shubhendu Ghosh staying there, along with a guest standing by with us, all ready to join us. Sakal.
Mark and Anil, we continue our rolling coverage here from G20 venue, special DD India studios set up to the viewers of DD India all across the globe. DD India Live, I'm Sakal Bhat. With me is my colleague Shubhendu, and we are joined by international affairs expert Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. We're going to, of course, decode the big takeaways of the Delhi Declaration, and also at the same time, all eyes are also set upon that big event in the evening, the closing ceremony or the closing statement. But yes, the fact of the matter, Dr. Sreeram, that India has dubbed the Delhi Declaration as historic and path-breaking and 100% consensus on all the geopolitical issues, etc. Plus the big takeaway of the Rajghat, when India took all the world leaders to Rajghat, the optics, the messaging, and what is the message that India wanted to send across early this morning?
Sakal, you know, peace and security is not part of the core mandate of G20. G20 is generally focused on global economic governance and on developmental issues. We have already achieved success on that front with the Delhi Declaration. Peace and security remain a stumbling block to achieve these economic and developmental goals of G20. And G20 Delhi Declaration specifically says we want dialogue, we want negotiation, we want a cessation of military attacks and hostilities against people, against civilians, against infrastructure. We want the Black Sea grain initiative to restart. We want to shield the developing countries from the ripple effects of the war in Ukraine. So we've already put in all the paragraphs and the sentences that convey a big message to the world. And on top of it, the Rajghat visit, what it suggests is India is the land of peace. And India is, you know, from the Buddha to Mahatma Gandhi, we've had a long, millennia-old tradition of not only practicing peace, but also never aggressing upon other countries. And remember, there are lines in the Delhi Declaration about territorial aggression, violating the UN Charter, how everybody should not, everybody should be on the same page when it comes to upholding international law, sovereignty. So I think going to Rajghat is one way of saying that, let us imbibe the spirit of the Mahatma and, circulate it through the whole world, because the whole world is watching G20 summit. And in India, we are saying the message of peace must go out, and peace at all costs. I would say peace is the highest, state of being in the world, and that's what Prime Minister is trying to achieve through this symbolic visit.
Absolutely, and a sort of active pursuance of peaceful resolutions. And during that beautiful visit to Rajghat, we could also see Mahatma Gandhi's quotation saying that my life is my message. So, and sort of action-oriented approach towards peace. And you're right, sir, when you mentioned about how G20 is primarily an economic grouping, but all the challenges that we've witnessed in the past years to global economy, one of them is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The manner in which India has been consistent about peaceful resolution of the conflict. And that's also emphasized very clearly in the New Delhi Declaration.
Yeah, and what we have also said, it's finely worded, it's balanced in such a way that we want warring parties.
We're not taking sides to say that peace is the way.
Exactly, and we are getting buy-in from all the warring parties. NATO and the Western powers have agreed to sign on to this. Russia has agreed to sign on to this. China has agreed to sign on to this. And these are all the main principal players in this conflict, And what we are trying to say is that through G20, we are trying to set high principles and values which should then percolate in the form of diplomatic action. India has always said we are ready to offer our good offices and to support peace initiatives. And I think through G20 we are already doing that. Of course, there's been no breakthrough. It's unfortunate the war in Europe has dragged on for more than a year and a half. But then ultimately, even how do wars end? Wars end through negotiation and diplomacy only. So we can never give up on that. And that sentence in the Delhi Declaration emphasizing the importance of diplomacy and negotiations, I think is a central one, because, this is not the era of war.
Yes.
It's not even a paragraph.
Yeah, I was
sentence.
coming to that. In fact, para 14 is a clincher. Para 13 is a small paragraph where, without really naming Russia, India has talked about, it calls on to other states to uphold territorial integrity that you're talking about. Peaceful resolution of conflicts is very, very critical. And then immediately after that, you have para 14, quote unquote, today's era is not the era of war.
It's not even a paragraph.
Exact. It's just one line of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and this has been India's position right at the very outset of the war.
And Sakal, this ties in with Rajghat visit.
Yes.
This one line, it's a clincher because it encapsulates India's vision for a peaceful humanity and for one family. When we say one family, peace and stability and security are very central to that, as part of the G20 agenda. And what we are saying is that we have to rise above partisanship. We have to rise above narrow pursuit of vested interests. We have to rise above pettiness, geopolitical, skullduggery. We have to actually show humanity that this institution, G20, can deliver on the hopes of humanity. Nobody wants war except a few interested groups, There
is also a fine contrast. I mean, at the very outset of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Shubhendu, we have seen most of the countries taking clear-cut positions and mostly on the fact of condemning Russia, calling out Russia, with their own conflict of interest, not only pertaining to the Russia-Ukraine war, but whatever histories they've had with Russia. India has been the only country where we've not really indulged in any sort of mudslinging out there.
And that's why
that's reflected in the G20 communique also, the daily declaration.
Yeah. And that's why we have succeeded to bring the Russians on board. You see, the build-up to the summit, Sakal, you remember, there were statements from the Russian side saying, we will not agree to this particular wording or this sentence or that, right? Finally, they agreed and signed on to the Delhi Declaration because we have managed to cut across to all parties and find loosely acceptable language that can be interpreted by different sides as a victory for them. That's the beauty of multilateral diplomacy.
No, but there's skepticism that what will India do? How will India walk the talk? Putin's absence and the whole build-up for that one paragraph for Ukraine, that there's not going to be any consensus on that. And I think these para 13 to para 15, they've really put all those speculation to rest forever.
You remember the speculation about will the Delhi summit, G20 summit of India, be the first one without a joint declaration?
Yes.
We actually proved all the cynics wrong by showing our ability to bring all sides together and to create this multilateral peace diplomacy. I would say it's like a peace offensive. We went for this, we got everybody on board, we narrowed down the differences. Our Sherpa, Mr. Amitabh Kant, was saying that we had lots of haggling with the Russians and the Chinese to agree to this, and of even the Western countries who were going for maximal kind of language that would put Russia in the dock. I think that also has been toned down. So I would say it's a balanced outcome, which shows it's not like we are not deciding who is right or wrong here.
Right.
It's about the future.
Right.
It's about what do we do now? How do we stop the fighting?
Right.
It's not about who is right or wrong.
And Professor Chaulia, there, in that context, what you're saying, now we look to the future. And in that context, this document becomes a starting point. It sort of gives a broad roadmap to which 2/3 of the world population, 80 to 90% of the world economic entities have agreed to. How does this proceed further on the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, when all these countries, 19 countries in the European Union, signing on a document, agreeing that peace and deliberation and diplomacy is the only way forward? What kind of a cascading impact it is likely to have on the conflict?
There have been a few peace processes underway, haltingly, have not succeeded fully. So there is a Minsk process that was between the Europeans and Russia, and involving Ukraine for a number of years since the Crimea. And then there have been other efforts. Turkey has tried to mediate.
That's what I meant. Like, what would this G20 declaration do things differently in the days ahead?
I would say that it is empowering peacemakers and mediators and facilitators to go for and clinch some kind of a ceasefire or stop the hostilities and start a negotiating process over the territorial dispute and all those things, and bring in parties to the table. I think what the G20 does is not in itself start a peace process, but to be a catalyst for existing processes and to strengthen what the G20 as a collective will of humanity represents in terms of what should be done. So I think they have laid down the guiding principles, and now it is up to some key parties. Even the Pope, the Vatican has been saying they will mediate between Russia and Ukraine. There are a number of countries, India and African Union has come up with their own peace plan, and many other countries have been trying. And we are also supporting many of those initiatives.
Given that the principal adversaries, if I were to put it like that, of the Russia-Ukraine conflict many of the leaders are part of the G20 as well. And when they sign on a document like that, so this does make it a priority for them to engage in dialogue. Because so far there's only been escalation, is what we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, look, the G20 does not have like a binding, it's not like a legally binding outcome, the Delhi Declaration. But as far as stating the intent and the will and the values, it's important. So to that extent, it's giving you...
You know, that point on intent, will and values of India under its presidency is widely reflected in these 80 plus paragraphs. You've actually gone through the whole declaration in detail. If you could also just touch upon the big firsts that we have seen under India's presidency. 100% consensus is what the government really has pitched it in. The way they're looking, the way they've kind of pitched this Delhi Declaration, building digital public infrastructure and the regulation of cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrency will come a little later. But this digital public infrastructure, it's India's big, I wouldn't say takeaway, but big component, which is the big first in the G20 communicate so far, whatever we have seen.
Yeah, so this is an emerging area. Digital public infrastructure, India is a world leader. We have innovated and we have, through digital, we have done massive financial inclusion of hundreds of millions of people. The whole world wants to know about it and wants to adapt the Indian innovation. And by getting digital public infrastructure and a whole framework around it into the G20 system, we are able to now export our best practices in order to benefit the whole of humanity. Think about it. Something designed by our scientists, our software people, and our technicians is going to benefit not just 1.4 billion people, but also 7 billion people of the whole planet.
It must work like a model in which these public goods could be utilized.
And many of the principles of digital infrastructure which we designed for our domestic are now going to be externalized. This is a tremendous achievement.
Right, and we'll talk about how that plays out, but for now, we'll be going back to our Delhi studios, but this conversation from the backdrop of Bharat Mandapam continues in just a bit. Back to the Delhi studio.
Well, thanks a lot, Shubhendu and Sakal and Professor Sreeram Chaulia for breaking up the declaration for us and putting it into context. And we continue to have...
There at Bharat Mandapam, we've got Sakal and Sakal Bhat and Shubhendu Ghosh standing by to get us the latest. They've got a guest waiting by. So over to you.
100 billion. Yeah. Okay, we are on air now.
Welcome back to DD India's exclusive coverage from Bharat Mandapam, the venue of a G20. Our continued coverage continues. I'm Shubhendu with my colleague Sakal. Professor Sreeram Chaulia continues to be with us. Joining us is a very special guest, Professor John Kirton, Founder Director, G20 Research Group, Canada. Professor Kirton, welcome to DD India. Now, your opening thoughts on the New Delhi Declaration, and also many see the declaration as the conclusion of the G20 summit, but what you do is really the beginning of a long and important journey. Give us a perspective on that.
Well, the Delhi summit was a substantial step forward in global governance at a critical time. It did address all of the many challenges that the world faces, including by far the greatest one of all, climate change, the natural environment, biodiversity, pollution. But the range of things it dealt with is broader than any G20 summit before, with a new emphasis on the hard issues of peace and security, long thought to be the property of the United Nations Security Council, but it's not doing enough. So at Delhi, the G20 stepped in to help do the job.
Okay, but how do you look at it, this being in terms of path-breaking and historic for the Indian Prime Minister's leadership, especially when the way India has navigated through certain contentious issues like Russia-Ukraine conflict, which, by the way, garnered a lot of skepticism at how India is going to deal with that one paragraph. But then the results are in front of you.
Yeah, on Russia's aggression against Ukraine, it was basically a replay of what we saw at Bali last year. Very few people thought we would get a full consensus communique until the very last minute.
Yes.
And that was true here, but lo and behold, we did. as I actually expected we would. I certainly knew that if President Widodo could do it, certainly Prime Minister Modi, with much more skill in G20 diplomacy and so much else, much more power behind him, a central figure in global governance for a long period of time. He could pull it off, and he did. The real question was how he dealt with, I think, the new defining disagreement.
Yes.
Because at Bali, at second stage, was what about China and the rest? But China loomed very large here. The first time that Xi Jinping decided, along with Mr. Putin, just to skip the summit, stay at home. Was that a snub, a shot against Mr. Modi personally? We don't want your summit to succeed. But the great achievement of the institution of Mr. Modi's summitry was that it could do so much without the president, the leader of Russia and China.
But was it really a snub? I mean, India's not looking at it like a snub.
Well, one of the important things, and it's a matter of the process of where the G20 goes from here.
Okay.
You know, yes, the headline, it was easy to see at the opening, right? Yes, the African Union added.
Right.
But I think far more important was the agreement that after the hosts we know next year and the year after, that it's going back to the USA,
Right.
even though China tried to veto that.
Right.
But everybody else said, do we back China or do we back
But
the
before that
USA?
happens-
And they chose the USA.
Before that happens, Professor, before US or any other country gets the presidency, is Brazil who's going to be leading
The
the
next chair,
G20.
yeah.
We've been showing images of how the leaders of Indonesia, India, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and Brazil, they shared a sapling, there's a movement, there's a troika. Which is popularly the term coined. So we see G20 presidency traversing through very key emerging developing economies, global south, leaders of the global south. How significant is this phase according to you from Indonesia to India at present and now to Brazil?
Yeah, it's not just any emerging economies, and the one genuinely developing country, South Africa, in the G20.
Yes.
It's the IBSA group. So their leaders have a long history of cooperating at the summit level. So the Troika has now come into the G20 from IBSA. It's also, of course, covering very different regions of the world, too. So I think that's what's important. But the thing I would underscore is it's not just any emerging economy
Yes.
or developing. They're all democracies, right? And then when you add the United States after, and they spoke about beginning a new cycle,
Yes.
which really means it would be followed by the United Kingdom, Canada, South Korea, before we get to, well, Mexico, and then Russia would be up next.
So is this the new direction, would you like to come in here, that Prime Minister spoke about yesterday, this new century is about the new direction also?
Yeah.
India is now leading that direction.
Yeah, I think what we have done is we have steered the G20 in a certain direction and it becomes irreversible, because every summit, whatever it adds on, cannot be changed or pushed back. So what it does now is the new agenda items we've brought in, for example, digital public infrastructure, regulating cryptocurrencies, regulating artificial intelligence, limiting, along with innovation, also doing governance of these new technologies. For example, bringing gender into climate action and climate finance and connecting the two. There are lots of innovations that we have now been able to bring to the fore. And these, I think, now will then set the tone for them, because it's like we're passing on the baton, and they will carry forward the agenda that's been agreed at Delhi. So I think this is a milestone summit for that reason too, because we made it a developmental G20. And now, even when, let's say, the US and the UK and their turn comes, the combined will of the international community that accumulates through year after year will have to be heard and carried forward. Right. So in a way, we have institutionalized the Southern interests and values into the core of the G20 in such a way that now it's like suffused with it,
Right.
and now the G20 can be, said to be taking a developmental pathway, and it's on that route.
Right.
And
And
just to
Professor-
add to that, the development pathway or the development templates has been always traditionally an integral part of any summitry, because we have him with us, the summitry, such a renowned voice on summits so far. India spearheading a paradigm shift when we talk about the human-centric development. There is lot of emphasis on the human-centric development, and since he talked about the innovation, but India says innovation or artificial intelligence and all the technological advancements have to come with a certain sense of responsibility and accountability. You just cannot have a freeway, somebody is watching it.
Yes, and I think we see that mainstreamed throughout the communique. Digital public infrastructure, thanks to India, it's financial inclusion, right? Just like that, the click of a button, and all G20 countries could benefit from having that in their own homes, including the poorest people, which are still all too plentiful there. Another great surprise, you mentioned gender equality. It ranked second across subjects in the number of commitments
Yes.
that the Delhi summit made. Nobody expected that Mr. Modi would do so well on that,
the
even
pace
though
and
he
the
had
volume.
admirably said it would be women-led development.
Yes.
But
Yes.
now, in the G20, first it was the Canadian Prime Minister who was the gender equality champion, quickly joined by the President of France. But boy, I mean, Canadians badly wanted a champion from the global south, and we always pick India to be
Right.
it, and another great
Right.
success.
Professor
here.
Kirton, one of the conversations that has been going on for a long time, in G20 and also outside of it, is this really passionate demand for reform of multilateral institutions. Especially the United Nations to be in particular, but also financial institutions like World Bank, IMF and others. Now, the developing countries, the global south as we call them, we've seen them in the BRICS, their ability to reform themselves. BRICS become from a 5-member grouping to an 11-member grouping. One of the biggest development of the G20 is the inclusion of African Union, which is not like one organization, but 55 African countries. What difference does it make? How does it transform the character of G20 now for the years ahead, and also send a signal to the organization that are resisting this kind of reform for more than 7 decades?
Well, it was a nice symbol to start the summit with. Made the headlines on the first day, and sure, all of the G20 countries in varying degrees, but certainly Canada. I mean, we love Africa. You can't say no to Africa, but there's a lot of different countries and institutions in Africa. So I think the question is, yes, we'll have another leader, whoever's in charge of the African Union next year. The 41st or the 42nd leader at the table. I don't know if adding one more is going to make it more efficient or effective. I don't know what the leader of the African Union is going to say that we haven't heard from South Africa, who's been a member since 1999 when it started. I do know what the African Union will want the G20 members to do for it, but I don't yet know what the African Union as an institution will do for the G20.
Okay.
And through the G20 for global governance.
But still having the courage to reform, the courage to bring in that idea of inclusivity that
Of the global
India's
south
presidency has
also.
been talking about, not just in words and tokens, but in real action, as Professor Chaulia was saying, that these are changes that are going to be permanent and for times to come. So we see that the community of Global South is growing and broadening on these international platforms like the G20. That must make a difference.
That's right. Once you've added a member, you can't get rid of them, right? It's much too polite a club. What does happen is that if you have too many, it becomes another talk shop like the UN General Assembly, and all the real action goes elsewhere. to inner clubs. The Security Council P5 often do deals in the back room that are inconsistent with the charter, and the General Assembly is left to complain, but has no power of its own. We'll have to wait and see if adding the 6 particular countries the BRICS did helps at all, or really so changes the character. None of them are big emerging economies, which was the essence of the BRICS and a key membership criteria when it started. And I did note that the communique agreed that maybe the African Union was just the first. Other regional organizations. So when will this stop? 43 voices at the table, 44, and then who's next? So we'll have to see what President Lula has in mind, if anything, about that.
Yep. John, on the question of the Green Development Pact, that's been one of the big subheadings of the Delhi Declaration. And we noticed that the benchmarks for climate finance, for example, for developing countries for transition to green technology have been raised. Our Sherpa was saying we've gone from billions to trillions now. They're talking about $5.6 to $5.7 trillion required before 2030 for developing countries to adapt to climate and to go to green technology and all that. And it also says, the G20 says that in the year 2023, we expect the rich countries, advanced OECD countries, to shell out that $100 billion per annum, which they haven't done since committing to it in 2010. And so don't you think that this is also a big path-breaking forward movement? Because I know Canada is so big on climate and on combating climate change. This is great news for the environment. At least on paper, we have struck the right notes at the Delhi Declaration.
On paper, you're right, but the simple answer to your question is no. It's deeply disappointing that, yes, they said, we get the problem. It's a climate emergency. We need trillions to do it. But then you ask the country that every developing country, everyone in debt distress is asking, where's the money, which we need now? And what the major message of this is, no new money. So, yes, $100 billion a year, they said nice words about it. They actually said it had already been done by somebody. That's very different than saying, we're getting out of checkbooks at the table, the rich ones, and we're writing a check to get up to 100 billion. And oh, by the way, here's the check for next year with a date on it for 200 billion. That's what we needed. That's what
So Professor Kirton, if you could simplify for us, what happens next? Now we've got a declaration at place. When a G20 Leaders Summit concludes with the declaration, what action begins after that? What kind of accountability, what kind of monitoring, what kind of timeline is established to, because that's the kind of work that you focus on. Take us through that, simplify that movement for us from here on.
You're right. Fine words on paper, the glow of success at the sunny summit peak, but then all the leaders descend into the dark valleys of domestic politics at home. Get distracted, let's give them the benefit of the doubt, and don't implement what they promised to do. So compliance.
It's not a binding document. So what about the deterrence and the compliance of it?
Yeah, a lot of the commitments actually are weak ones, but still, will they deliver? Will they actually comply? And the G20 Research Group has done that from the start of G20 Summitry. The overall average of compliance, about 71%.
That's not
pretty
5%.
good, but not nearly enough. The good news, Bali last year, it was up to 79%.
Can India take this a notch up?
Can Mr. Modi do better? We'll have to...
I'm compelled to ask this one final question before we hand it over to Mark and Anil. What does this G20 under India's presidency do to India's stature under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi?
Well, it puts it at the center of global governance, where in some important respects it's been for a very long time. If you look at leaders, the summit level, take your mind back to 1945. There was a UN summit in San Francisco, but then none for decades. But the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. The new one, the modern multiracial Commonwealth, that was created by India in 1947. And of course, 55 countries in the Commonwealth, they look to India as the exemplar even before, Britain blotted its copy.
India takes the center stage. That's the bottom line.
Absolutely. And
global center stage.
Much bigger and better, I think, than ever before. Back in the Commonwealth, until the Delhi summit, India was not the country that was...
Comes from somebody who has been an authority on the summitories and the summits so far. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for those insights, Professor John Kirton. Professor Chaulia, I request you to continue to stay with us. We'll be getting you this non-stop coverage from Bharat Mandapam, the G20 venue, insights into what the declaration means and the road ahead. But for now, it's toss back to our Delhi studio, Anil and Mark.
Thanks very much, Shubhendu, Sakal, Professor Sreeram Chaulia and Professor John Kirton, who were talking to us directly from the Bharat Mandapam.